I still see participant numbers climbing, so welcome to everyone who joined over the last minute, and I will slowly get started with our Academy session. So welcome to the UN Global Compact Academy. My name is Anna Krüb. I am Senior Manager for Environment and Climate at the United Nations Global Compact, and very excited to welcome you to this special debrief on COP27. Over the next hour, we will learn about the key outcomes from COP27 and main takeaways for business. And we will also look into key action items for business and industry to continue to drive credible climate action. Before we start, a few brief housekeeping remarks. So today you have a few tools at your disposal. The session has simultaneous translation available in Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And to activate this, please follow the instructions on your screen by clicking Interpretation and then selecting your language of choice. You can also view closed captions by clicking Live Transcript. The panelists will be answering questions live later in the session, and our colleagues are also on the line to answer your questions throughout the session via text. So please go ahead and submit any question you have using the Q&A feature. So looking at today's agenda, we will hear from UNFCCC on the COP27 outcomes and look ahead at the route from COP27 to COP28 and discuss what's next in the climate space and for the private sector. To kick us off, I'm excited to welcome Conor Barry, who will give us an overview of the main outcomes from COP27. Conor is Engagement and Climate Action Manager at UN Climate Change, the UN entity responsible for the climate negotiations. Then we will hear from Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, who will discuss the route ahead to COP28. As the high-level champion for COP27, he has been appointed by the current COP presidency, the Egyptian government, to bridge the many voluntary and collaborative actions taken by cities, regions, businesses, investors, and civil society with the work of governments. But first, we want to hear from you about your own takeaways and impressions from COP. So please follow the instructions on the screen to open the polls. You can go to www.mnt.com and enter the code. Alternatively, you can also scan the QR code on screen with your phone. And we will have a series of questions pop up on the device that you're using for joining this Mentimeter, so either your computer or your phone. And yeah, I'm starting to with the first questions. A few weeks after COP27, how are you feeling about the role of business in driving credible change? And we're already seeing the answers coming in. So for all of you who have not yet connected to Menti, on top of the screen, you can still see the instructions on how to be part of this poll. And we have a pretty mixed perspective. So some of us are optimistic, many are also disappointed, but for most of us, it's actually a mix of both. There are areas that make us feel optimistic and other areas where colleagues are disappointed. So let's look at that in a bit more detail in the next question. And the next question is actually open-ended, so you can type in your answers. And of course, feel free to keep it short so that we can look at a few answers from you. So what were you disappointed by at this COP? And there's answers coming in quickly. Lack of ambition, lack of credible action, not enough action or not concrete enough. Too many commitments, but lack of actions, which I think is something that really want to change with this COP of implementation. No talking about fossil fuel emissions. Credibility is a big topic coming up, and vague language in many of the decisions. Lack of clarity as well. So hopefully this session can help clarify a little bit the discussions, and lack of leadership. So before we get all frustrated by the slide, let me turn to the next question. From your perspective, what are the most positive outcomes of COP27? And same, this is also an open-ended question. Loss and damage, very clear. And I think we will hear about that much more in the discussions today. Networking as well, COP as a space to connect with peers, to connect with different type of stakeholders, participation, the commitments being shown, international collaboration is still possible, and moving into implementation. As of course, the goal of this COP was implementation of the Paris Agreement and Paris Rulebook. So yeah, thank you very much for your insights and for kicking us off. I think this set the scene very well to hear now from our experts. So without further ado, I'm happy to hand over to Conor Barry to give us his account of COP27 outcomes. Conor, over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anna, and thanks to the Global Compact for organizing today's event. Excellent to be able to speak to so many private sector from around the world on, I guess, having that mixed feeling. And I think mixed feelings are a norm and should be a norm after the COP, because the Egyptian presidency promised us a COP that would be focused on implementation. And I think they very much delivered a COP that's focused on implementation. But I guess when we refer to implementation COP, it's not a suggestion that we can deliver 100% implementation of all goals and commitments in one COP. So we will always, for the next number of years, come away a little bit disappointed from a COP, but a little bit also energized in the direction of travel that we need to look at. So from a macro perspective, I think it's really important that the presidency and the outcomes of the COP more broadly have very clearly established a much broader and more holistic perspective of implementation. So we have clearly have had in the past a North Star for mitigation in 1.5, in the IPCC report for 1.5 and what that means for emission trajectories. That North Star has existed in the past, but what we have this year, and I saw someone say no new goals as a disappointment. What we have this year is significant progress on a global goal in adaptation and understanding what adaptation means for people, for infrastructure, for natural systems. I think we got a very clear direction to the work on the global goal. It was always set up to be a 2-year process that would finish next year at COP28, but we didn't just get an intermediary outcome or a moment in time. We got a clear direction of travel as to what that global goal needs to address across the sectors that impact the private sector, that impact the real economy, and that impact lives and livelihoods. And I think that's a very clear signal of the process, that how the process needs to respond to development needs more broadly and create an integration between the development agendas and the climate agenda. Similarly, on loss and damage, and I've said repeatedly, we don't need a goal on loss and damage. It's a reality that we're facing, and it's a moral obligation that we address loss and damage when it occurs. Firstly, a moral obligation to do everything to minimize loss and damage occurring, but we have to recognize the science that there will be loss and damage into the future, regardless of the levels of mitigation and regardless of the levels of adaptation that are undertaken. There will be loss and damage, and the fact that countries have risen to that obligation, that moral obligation, to create funding arrangements and a mosaic of arrangements to address loss and damage and all of its different facets is particularly important, and we get an operationalization of the Santiago network in addition. So I think those macro components are particularly important. And as I said, looking at a implementation COP and never going to be walking away satisfied with the scale of the task ahead of us from any one COP on the full delivery of implementation, I think we have now tested and experienced what an implementation COP looks like. And it looks like opening the doors, and it looks like involving a whole range of stakeholders across different geographies, different regions, in understanding the challenges that they face in delivery of the goals that have been established. I think it's important we don't go back all the time and revisit goals. We have the SDGs, we have the goals of the Paris Agreement, we elaborate them a little bit further, but it's about working together and collaborating now to deliver on that. And I think what we face in COP27 is a clarity that different stakeholder groups are bringing in their challenges and their perspectives, and the opportunities and the difficulties that they face in delivering on those goals collectively, while also being conscious of other goals that people are faced with in a crisis of a poly-crisis at the moment on energy, on debt, and on food security. And I think if you step back and look globally, that we've managed to mobilize 110 heads of state to consider the climate challenge and the climate crisis as being one of the major crises that we're facing when we're facing many other crises, to recognize that crisis intersects across the energy crisis, the debt crisis, the food crisis, and the benefit of multilateralism, I think, is particularly important. And I want to turn then a little bit more towards the micro and the outcomes rather than that macro perspective. We have, moving from a negotiation to implementation, a whole range of work programs and those work programs are a basis for engaging stakeholders, engaging the private sector in a much more dynamic way and in a much more integrated manner. And the first is moving ahead with a mitigation work program that was initiated in Glasgow last year. We now have modalities for that work program that includes building upon the finance forums and the investment focus forums that had been championed by our champion this year, being fully integrated into that formal process and ensuring that we're getting the investment flows and turning the commitments of net zero assets into flows for mitigation activities and mitigation projects in all regions. And that's very clearly embedded now into the mitigation work program. We've got a launch of a just transition work program, again, making clarity that the transition, the energy transition that is underway and building momentum needs to be one that respects a whole range of rights and delivers justice for communities. I think that's a particularly important area for engagement of the private sector in the years to come. And we have the global stocktake in its first year of operation, and again, a process for the private sector to engage very meaningfully through this year in the two technical dialogues, and again into the technical dialogues in the political phase that will be run next year. So all of those work programs and dialogues create a basis for future engagement, and we've got a launch both of the Santiago Network, dialogues on the financial goals of the Paris Agreement and Article 2.1c, and aligning all financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Again, these are areas that a very clear call from parties to engage non-party stakeholders, to engage the private sector in those dialogues and in the discussion of how implementation can be taken forward in a manner that achieves the goals, but delivers a just transition and delivers a wider alignment of the financial sector. So I think we have to look at the COP outcomes in that light and in that perspective, that we're no longer speaking to the climate community solely and setting targets for the climate community solely, but we're setting targets for the world as a whole and recognizing that the outcomes and the goals that are set by the UNFCCC process have deep implications across a whole range of agendas and a whole range of sectors. We'll also see a cover decision that speaks for the first time in headings on energy, on oceans, on forests, and touches on the topics that and the areas of the world in which the private sector is engaged, and turning the Coronivia joint work program on agriculture into a work program on agriculture and food security, again touching on the role that the private sector plays in delivering food security together with governments. So there are a number of areas where we have a clear delivery and a clear role for the private sector in the UNFCCC process. And lastly, I'm sure Heidi will touch on this when you get to the fireside discussion in a moment, but the accountability mechanism and the launch of the high-level expert group's recommendations on net zero commitments and the Secretary General's request to UNFCCC to ensure that there is an accountability system and a verification of that data that's fit for purpose, I think are core components of that outcome and integrating private sector implementation and private sector activities into the UNFCCC process in a more structured way. And as we move forward into this year and beyond, I think we're going to see more structure placed on that without trying to bureaucratize the contributions of the private sector to implementation. And that's always a challenge when you're combining a UN system with a more dynamic system from the private sector, to ensure that there is structure and people understand how it's operating, but you don't overly bureaucratize it. So that's going to be our challenge as we move ahead towards COP28 and beyond. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Conor, for these insights. And as you mentioned, we will deep dive a bit more into the issues you raised in the second half of the session, and also respond to questions from all of you joining us live today. But I think one key takeaway is we're setting targets for the world as a whole. This is not for like some sort of sub-community, and paired with a clear call to engage the private sector. So now let's hear from Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin on his vision for the way ahead. Dr. Mohieldin, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honor to join this panel. And let me just build on this excellent introduction by Conor just now, and provide some reflections and on what happened in COP27 and the events and the activities in this process, and emphasize it's a process that started for many years now. It's talking about COP27. Shouldn't really be getting us forgetting what had been achieved in previous COPs, including the achievement of a legal framework, Paris Agreement, pledges and coalitions in Glasgow, and now the implementation COP of COP27, and then going forward, what I consider to be an accountability COP in a way, given that's going to be the COP for stock taking and beyond. So as a coordinator of the non-state actors, I'll be focusing more on the contributions and what can I consider as firsts in a way. People take it from different perspectives on how can we assess the success of a COP or otherwise. I would say on the substance, people really focus more on participants, the numbers. I think in terms of numbers, we had a huge number of participants. In terms of representation, being inclusive, in addition to leaders, we had a great deal of participation from the private sector, civil society organizations, think tanks, research centers, and beyond. But I like to put the assessment on three categories approach. One, what I consider as the breakthrough category. The second is about a satisfactory kind of achievement. The third is mainly about avoiding backsliding. So based on these categories, I would say I would put, as mentioned perhaps in the assessment before this discussion, the loss and damage file, not just the fund, but the whole discussion. We shouldn't be forgetting that the whole file and issue had been forgotten for many years since the first meeting in Rio, and to put it in the agenda now, to have a fund about it, and focusing on funding it, and to have a committee of 24 members, 14 representing developing economies and 10 from the advanced economies. They should be nominated soon, and they should have the first meeting before end of March, as indicated in the cover document. So that loss and damage is a huge success. The second, on the breakthrough, I would say calling for transformation of financial architecture. This is very serious, and it's not just limited to climate and climate finance. The call by Maya Mottley, Prime Minister Maya Mottley, and others, supported by President Macron, I think that will have serious implications in the coming months, because now the dichotomy between climate finance and development finance have been challenged. The expectations from the development finance institutions and the specialized entities had risen a lot. And now we need really to see how that is going to be materialized in actions and different ways of doing business for climate finance and development finance, by challenging this false dichotomy between climate and development. At the end of the day, climate action is SDG 13. I would say in the satisfactory kind of achievement, Good practical steps in an implementation COP. I saw it first on the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, with a focus on particular areas of concern today, like food and agriculture, water and nature, coastal zones and oceans, human settlements, infrastructure, and in all of these aspects, there are rooms for public-private partnerships for implementation. The second is getting a very useful step in the implementation of the early warning systems for all, which can definitely serve the resilience adaptation effort, and of course is going to be very much essential for any kind of work for the loss and damage operations. The third is the mitigation work program. A mitigation work program was launched in Sharm el-Sheikh, aimed at urgently scaling up mitigation ambition and implementation. On related matter on the mitigation efforts and pledges, I'm taking that from state and non-state actors' perspective. So there is a great deal of commitments in the decarbonization, but again, I think any kind of work in the pledges side should be guided, or perhaps more than guided, by the recommendations of Minister McKenna's report on net zero, which was launched during the Sharm el-Sheikh events and as part of the discussions on how to get the whole process, including the expected leadership of the UNFCCC, work in this direction. This has serious implications on what we should be announcing, how can we use voluntary credits, how to phase out from fossil fuel and investing in renewables, how to accelerate the road to acceleration. This will have serious implications on the financial and non-financial sectors going forward, especially when it comes to embracing some of these ideas when it comes to global, regional, and national regulations. And the fourth area that I can consider as part of this category of satisfactory development is about the emphasis on just transition. We saw last year in Glasgow the promise to South Africa, but this year we got the promise to Indonesia, $20 billion of just transition support, again phasing out from fossil fuel and investments in renewables and dealing with the impact on local communities in participation with the private sector. I'm very proud that Sharm el-Sheikh witnessed the launching of the first carbon credit market for Africa. This will have potential, and you'll be seeing lots of announcements on that. As a chair of the GFANZ Africa, this is one of the areas that we'll be focusing on in the future, the carbon credit market. It's a voluntary one. Another area of work is basically about debt swaps to invest in climate and nature. And this is going to be more of KPI related kind of work rather than just being project specific. So we're moving from the Belize Seychelles type into a Barbados kind of KPI based investments. I'm happy to see as well in this category some decent work by the insurance sector through the Nairobi Declaration Insurance, with pledges to support the work in adaptation. $14 billion have been committed. And then localization work, how to translate all of that kind of work into local efforts. And there is some decent work as well on the regionalization by building a pipeline of projects, because that had been an issue of a standard question or issue of concern, especially after the announcements of the GFANZ. We have the $130 asset-backed institutions committed for the net zero, but we're at the pipeline of projects. I'm happy to say today that in cooperation between the presidency of the COP27, the UN climate champions, and the UN system, now we have a compendium of investable projects, and there is a report. You can Google it. It's available as well on our website on the from assets to flows, how to translate the assets into investable funds. And the final category, just to remind you, the first one was basically the breakthroughs. The second one, satisfactory progress. And the final one is basically about avoiding backsliding. I have read some comments about ambitions and the 1.5 degrees and whether it's alive or not. 1.5 degrees in terms of pledges and documents are very much alive. When it comes to action, this is basically what we need to have. Nothing in the text that came out from Sharm el-Sheikh is compromising the 1.5 degrees. It's the action that are required to be changed. Based on the IEA, our progress so far is going to be getting us into 1.7 degrees warming by 2050. This is very much far from the 1.5 degree. There had been a slight progress from COP26 of 1.8 degree to 1.7, but in order to do some serious work, all of our pledges, our NDCs need to be scaled up at least by 6 to 7 times in order to see the realization of work. Nothing in the text of Sharm el-Sheikh should be preventing the advanced economies from doing a better job in reducing emissions. We see some actions in different directions when it comes to the commitments in the implementation, and nothing in the text as well should prevent the advanced economies from committing not just to the 100 billion, because it's just a fraction of what is required for funding a gap of no less than 1 trillion from now until 2025, and less than 5% if we are committed to finance from 2025 to 2030. The requirements is around $2.4 trillion. So that is basically making a fundamental change on how we are dealing with issues related to how to fund the work on climate and development finance. I encourage you all to have a look at this very important report commissioned by COP26 and COP27 presidency, led by Nick Stern and Vera Songwe, on how to finance climate action and development in order to identify where are the gaps and how to do a better public-private partnerships, especially in the adaptation area. Having said that, very grateful to the opportunity. I have a hard stop almost a minute from now, but I'll be on the phone just in case if there is any question directed to me. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much for sharing your perspective and these important points. And many thanks to both you and Conor for taking the time to join us today. Fully understand you have to move on to your next commitment, but I think it was really important to hear both on the outcomes of COP27 as well as what needs to happen now. And from my side, I think a few key takeaways are we need to challenge the false dichotomy between climate and development. And 1.5 is very much alive in the texts, but it is in the emergency room when we look at the action. So that's where we need to start. And that's where the private sector, of course, has a key role to play. So in the next segment, I'm excited to introduce now our next two speakers. We will examine the COP27 outcomes a bit closer and discuss what comes next for the private sector. So I'm delighted to welcome Heidi Huusko, who is co-lead of the high-level expert group on net zero at the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General, and Jennifer Park, Senior Advisor in the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Team. And for all of you joining us live, please continue submitting questions via the Q&A function. Our team will respond to some of them in writing, and we will guide our conversation around these questions alongside those submitted by many of you when you registered for this session. So without further ado, let me kick off the conversation. Jen, you are part of the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Team and work closely with him on the UN's climate strategy and vision. What do you identify as the main outcomes of COP27, building on what we heard from our speakers earlier today?
Many thanks, Anna, and many thanks to Conor and Mahmoud for that very thorough and really informative kind of overview of the outcomes of COP27. So there's really not much else to cover beyond what Conor and Mahmoud said, but just from kind of the SG's perspective, I guess there are a few things that I did want to identify as what we saw as really, really important things coming out of Sharm. The first is kind of the, we saw this in the responses to the poll at the beginning of this session is the power of multilateralism and the importance of international collaboration and cooperation. They're very much alive, and they're very much necessary to effectively tackle the climate crisis. Not just, cooperation, not just amongst governments and parties, but also across all stakeholders and actors and across all sectors of society and the economy. And I think the JETPs are kind of a really key kind of demonstration of how that level of coordination and collaboration can really deliver effective tools to help bend the emissions curve. And as many mentioned, the decision to establish a loss and damage fund was a really historic moment and the culmination of several decades of calls and advocacy, strong advocacy by developing countries, particularly the small island developing states and the least developed countries. And it was really, really amazing to really see this all kind of come to fruition at Sharm. And it's really an important step for climate justice, but also restoring trust between parties. One of the major challenges we face in the UNFCCC negotiations and kind of global kind of relations writ large is kind of this breakdown in trust between member states. And kind of this is a really significant step towards rebuilding that trust. But, as Conor and Mahmoud said, the really hard work remains ahead this year for the Transitional Committee and kind of establishing the details and setting out the recommendations on how to take this decision forward and to develop kind of a fund within the broader context of kind of support to address loss and damage and how this can be effectively developed to address kind of the key priorities and needs coming from developing countries when it comes to loss and damage. And on the mitigation front, we thought that it was amazing that the COP27 decisions really kept 1.5 alive. So not only did the decision continue to protect the 1.5 degree temperature goal, but it also reflected the urgent need for action, not just within this critical decade, but within the next couple of years. It's not, we can't wait until right before 2030. We need to start acting now. And if we want to reduce emissions by 2030, and then also even keep the hopes of achieving net zero by 2050 globally alive. And so we were also pleased to see that the COP27 decisions, we thought, took this all a step further in that it contained unprecedented language on renewables in the COP decision. It had a separate section on energy, and it had separate kind of clauses on renewable energy, not low emissions energy, not clean energy, but renewables. And so it sets kind of a blueprint on how we work to achieve and keep 1.5 alive. And so we thought it really reflected the resounding support that we heard, not only in the negotiation rooms in the formal UNFCCC process, but outside in the corridors, at the Leader Summit, in the pavilions amongst non-state actors and the private sector. So not only the support for renewables, but the imperative of accelerating the deployment of renewables over the next several years. And we thought it was great that even though it didn't have a goal for what we need to achieve in renewables, it does specify the level of financing and investment that is necessary, which I think in the decision it says $4 trillion annually by 2030, which is consistent with a 1.5 modeled pathway and for achieving net zero by 2050. So I know there was a lot of disappointment that the language on fossil fuel phase out didn't go further in this decision, but we think that this is kind of an alternative way around that to kind of achieve the same goal. And so we thought that was a really, really good development, and the fact that the decision also referenced kind of initiatives that could help kind of further bolsters this case, whether that there are tools out there, initiatives out there that we can build on to further bend the emissions curve, such as the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, and then the SG in a lot of his statements at COP really kind of promoted this idea of a climate solidarity pact, which would be, in his mind, a step further, a pact between developed countries and emerging economies in the G20 to kind of really work together to accelerate the renewables revolution. we thought that it was really important that the COP decision also really explicitly stressed that there is no excuse for backsliding or the deprioritization of climate action. We thought that was really important for leaders and all countries to really agree and really identify their commitment to progressing climate action, and that they would work together to kind of move forward, regardless of what the geopolitical situations may be. We thought it was great that the COP decision also captured the resounding call for the overhaul of the multilateral development banks and the international financial institutions, and Conor and Mahmoud touched upon that, so I won't go further into that, but the fact that there is this strong call to make them fit for purpose to address the climate emergency is, and the fact that they kind of call out the fact that there's strong inequities in access to finance for developing countries, and that is something that needs to change, was really important. And this is really the key to unlocking a lot of kind of the implementation we need to see and action on the ground, especially when it comes to renewables. And of course, I can't end this without giving a shout out to the fact that there seemed to be a lot of support for the Secretary General's early warning systems for all initiative as a part of the response to protect lives and livelihoods from the growing impacts of the climate crisis, and the welcoming of the SG's high-level expert group's recommendations as an important outcome for COP. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jen, and so many important insights. I think some of them already answered some of the questions that we are receiving in the chat. Important to update, to point out that renewable energies are explicitly mentioned in the text. And as you say, not just low energy sources, low emission energy sources. And one point that I kind of want to pick on that you mentioned is like the importance of rebuilding trust in the intergovernmental process, which the breakthrough on loss and damage has definitely helped with. And I think the issue of trust is also something that is very much on top of the agenda when we talk about private sector action and the engagement of companies and commitments. So with that, I want to turn over to Heidi. Heidi, you have co-led the work of the high-level expert group on net zero, announced and convened by the UN Secretary General after COP26. And so not everyone in the audience will probably be familiar with the group's mandate and their work. So can you explain to us why it was created in the first place and how the group worked together throughout this year?
Thank you, Anna, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today alongside all these other distinguished speakers. And so taking a few steps back on why the high-level expert group was convened by the Secretary General in the lead up to this COP, and especially also the last COP, we saw a lot of engagement from the private sector. And of course, that is good that private sector is engaging in the climate crisis and is coming forward with the solutions that are needed. But we also saw that there was a lot of commitments that were done around net zero, and many of these commitments were also self-claimed by the companies, financial institutions themselves. And within this, there was a skepticism that started around what those commitments actually entail, because many of these commitments were, of course, forward-looking. We're talking about net zero by 2050, but it also meant that a lot of the private sector was putting their actions very far into the future, while on the other hand, we need action very soon. Now we only have 7 years until 2030 when we need to have emissions. So because of this, there was a lot of talk about greenwashing, and the Secretary General announced that he wanted to create this group to bring clarity, to push forward for credible commitments and review from an accountability and integrity process of what these commitments were about. And I think we've heard the Secretary General many times really put spot on into this, and he says, we cannot afford slow movers, we cannot afford fake movers or any type of greenwashing. And this is really the umbrella of why this group was put together. And what was exceptional with this high-level expert group is that it was very diverse, both on the gender side and on the geographic point of view. We had 16 high-level experts from across all regions, and the work was led by Minister Catherine McKenna from Canada. This group worked under a very short time process with doing a lot of consultations with stakeholders already engaging in this space. And when we speak about non-state actors, stakeholders came in from business, from financial institutions, as well as cities and regions. So from our end at the Secretariat side, we helped also facilitate all those discussions. There was a portal where stakeholders could make submissions. So there was a really wide consultations to then land into the recommendations.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for that. Maybe before kind of deep diving a bit more into the recommendation themselves, Jen, you mentioned JETP's renewable energy and the imperative to accelerate the deployment of renewables for a just transition. And just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the role of the private sector, both in terms of which role the private sector has played in the past and how they can continue to be part of the solution in response to this call for renewables.
Thanks so much, Anna. So as I mentioned before, and as mentioned by colleagues, the COP decisions really reflected the urgency of a need for accelerated deployment of renewables and the just transition to a clean energy future. And this was reflected, as a result of kind of discussions that were held within the formal negotiation process, kind of, judging from the language of, citing the importance of renewables as outlined in the cover decision, but also, in the creation of the Just Transition Work Program and the ministerial that is to accompany it. So it's an increasing kind of an issue that has really come to the fore and then kind of reached a peak at Sharm, and hopefully that it continues in future COPs. But also on the outside, as I mentioned, there was kind of initiatives that were reflected in the COP decision as the Just Energy Transition Partnership, and kind of, there's a lengthy list of initiatives, as Mahmoud cited, and of actions that took place outside of the formal negotiation rooms. And, some of these were, Egypt itself announced kind of a JETP-esque deal in terms of working with the EU, Germany, and US to mobilize $500 million, which is hopefully going to leverage, I believe, about $10 billion to kind of displace the deployment of 5 gigs of fossil gas, but and then kind of accelerate the deployment of 10 gigawatts of solar and wind, which we think is huge. And we saw kind of philanthropies pooling $500 million themselves to finance just energy transitions in low and middle income countries over the next 2 to 3 years. And then we saw the launch of the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. A lot of these things wouldn't have been able to happen without kind of a very all hands on deck approach and with kind of the strong participation of the private sector. So the thinking is public finance can't kind of finance everything, and it can take us kind of a significant step forward and help leverage kind of the private finance that we need. And so we keep talking about these just energy transition partnerships, and basically this was something that the first kind of South Africa Just Energy Transition Partnership was launched at COP26, but it kind of the SG had long been calling for the creation of these coalitions of support around emerging economies to help accelerate their transition away from coal that was underpinned by an accelerated deployment of renewable energies. And what we saw as an answer to that call this year was the G7 really working to kind of form these partnerships, the JETPs around, Indonesia, furthering work in South Africa, and they're currently working to see if something can be had with Vietnam and, hopefully with India next year. But we think that the real contribution of the JETP, in addition to kind of helping progress this pivot towards renewables, but it really shows the power of international cooperation and coordination. A lot, a just energy transition is a really, really complicated and challenging issue. It's not something that, one kind of segment of government or even government alone can solve by itself. It really needs kind of multi-stakeholder support, and really the involvement and participation of the private sector really kind of help propel these forwards. I mean, that's pretty evident in the financial package of the Indonesian Just Energy Transition Partnership. I mean, the overall package was 20 billion, but half of that was public finance and half of that was private finance. And, if you look at the political declaration within the Indonesian JETP, there is room for, if certain conditions are met and seeing how progress goes, that even further private sector finance can be mobilized under the Indonesian JETP in support of their overall objectives. And so, that was the role that the private sector has played, and they really helped to push kind of for different policy reforms to be had and be adopted in kind of these beneficiary countries. But that being said, there still continues to be a huge role that private sector can play in terms of some issues that were identified and really discussed at COP27 was for the accelerated deployment of renewables, how do we overcome kind of the finance issues, the investment costs, the fact that the cost of capital in developing countries is 7 times higher than in developed countries. So how do we work together to develop kind of tools and approaches financially to kind of address those needs? How do we, ensure the diversification of the supply chain and critical technologies and raw materials for, renewable energy technology? How do we make these critical technologies like battery storage a global public good? How do we continue to work with private sector to ensure that, there's all these commitments for public finance to pivot away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. So how do we ensure that the private sector investments are turning in the same direction and at the pace and scale that we need it to? So these are kind of quick thoughts on, the role and the collaboration, that we need to keep engaging and having dialogue with the private sector to work together to kind of find solutions to kind of these issues.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that overview. And I think you mentioned like private sector, both in terms of investments as well as advocacy, is crucial to build out renewables. And of course, the other side of the coin is also to stop investing in fossil fuels. And I think that's something that's also discussed or was discussed by the high-level expert group on net zero. So turning back to Heidi, could you give us an overview of the recommendations that the high-level expert group came forward with and that are summarized in the report Integrity Matters that was presented to the SG at the COP? And judging from the questions we get in the Q&A box, our audience is particularly interested to hear about carbon credits and fossil fuels as well, and how those are mentioned in the recommendations.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna. So these recommendations are historic. I recommend for everyone to read the recommendations as well as the Secretary General's response to the recommendations as well. The recommendations look at 10 different areas. I will not go into all of them now, but I thought that it could be interesting if I just give you a couple of those, highlights, so to say, from the areas. The recommendations are a how-to guide. They are aimed to the various initiatives in the net zero landscape, but also to companies, financial institutions, cities and regions themselves. I think, Anna, you already mentioned the carbon credit topic and the fossil fuel topic. So these are, of course, very big, difficult topics to tackle. I'd want to say on the fossil fuel piece that the recommendations is talking about phasing out fossil fuels. It's not about phasing down, but ending the use of fossil fuels. So this is a really big, important outcome and recommendation for everyone who's working on these topics. The other part you mentioned, Anna, carbon credits. So offsetting is not allowed to be part of how a company or financial institution, city or region is delivering to their net zero commitment. We need to see real emission cuts, and within that, I wanted to mention that the scenarios that these commitments need to align with is IPCC and basically the latest science to keep us on the 1.5 track. What is also new is that the group is talking a lot about interim targets, including on having interim targets every 5 years, starting in 2025. So that will also give a shift, I think, to how many out there are working with their targets towards net zero. And the other very relevant part is that we are talking about all greenhouse gas emissions and all scopes 1, 2, 3. It's very exciting to see kind of this new level of ambition with how to set net zero targets. And with that also comes an element which I think is worth mentioning, and that is about transition plans. Because what we've seen is many companies are making these commitments, but we're unsure about what that transition look like. So the expert group is calling on those transitions plans to be publicly available. They also have are calling on the management to be accountable for it, and for there to be actions towards the management in itself with delivering onto these targets and goals. And I think, then going kind of moving outside from the targets themselves, and Conor Barry from UNFCCC touched upon this, is the accountability itself. I mean, we're talking about transparency, we're talking about reporting, disclosing how you're following up on these targets and commitments, but it's also about understanding from an aggregated point of view how we are delivering towards the Paris Agreement and where we actually stand, and how non-state actors can deliver this confidence into policymakers that there is action needed, and to also understand from a policy perspective what is needed from the regulation side in order to move those laggards that are unfortunately there to move them onwards. And I'm sure with many of you here today listening to this session, I mean, I'm sure you're here because you want to contribute and you want to be part of this movement. And therefore, these recommendations really will set the next level of leadership. And we welcome everyone to take on board all those recommendations. And finally, Anna, I wanted to mention that what is also new element is that the expert group also looked at the net zero commitments from a just transition perspective, which I know is another big topic that you at the UN Global Compact have also been working on for a long time with partners.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And we are almost out of time, but I think this conversation is really interesting. And I want to bring up one last point that was submitted to us by a participant when registering for this session, which is around lobbying and coherence of corporate action when it comes to climate commitments, but also advocacy work. And so I think many of us have seen the headlines on the high presence of private sector at the COP, which is very encouraging, but also the presence of lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry, for example. So I believe this topic has also been covered by the high-level expert group. So Heidi, if you, in 1 minute, if you could tell us a little bit more about the recommendations around lobbying and advocacy.
Great. No, this is a very, very important topic, and thanks for those of you who brought it up. So, of course, you know, on the one hand, you go and make your commitments, but on the other hand, you also need to ensure that the full company is following up on that commitment, and it's not working counterproductively through trade organizations, through other parts of the company with not delivering on the commitment. And I think that is also why that particular recommendations around the management and how the management should be intensivized with delivering on the targets will be important. One aspect and one part of the recommendation which is very interesting and which we hope will bring a lot of difference is that there is a specific recommendation also looking at PR companies, lawyers, accountancy companies who are working with fossil fuel industry to make sure that they are not contributing to the greenwashing, because in many cases we see a lot of marketing of green products, green transitions, when on the other hand it's very well known that that is not actually the case. So that's an important recommendation, and we really hope to see that brings a lot of change into the system.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and thank you as well, Jennifer, for joining us for this very interesting conversation. And one last question that reached us is, what can the private sector now very concretely do to take a leadership role in climate discussions? With this, I would like to move to the last segment of our session today. Before listing a few key steps companies can take and some details on how the UN Global Compact can support you on this journey, I would like to summarize some of the main points raised by our speakers today. So, of course, we have heard that COP27 has made vital progress towards channeling financial support to vulnerable communities on loss and damages. It has elevated concerns beyond mitigation, namely on the global goal on adaptation, on the UNSG's call for universal coverage of early warning systems. Just transition very strongly featured throughout the decisions, and a more sophisticated discussion on finance and the growing demand for reform. At the end of the day, of course, the best way to limit loss and damage remains cutting emission as fast as possible and at a large scale. And so we are encouraged to see that countries agreed that we really need to keep 1.5 degrees as the limit. But as we have heard, we're still missing an explicit mention of the phase down of all fossil fuels and the peaking of emissions by a specific date. So generally speaking, for business, we saw, of course, high engagement throughout the COP. And as Heidi pointed out, a large focus was on accountability, with the Net Zero Expert Group putting together its recommendations, and very much encourage you to read those in detail. And from the UN Global Compact side, we convened a series of events in support of the Business Action Agenda, and you can find recordings of all of those events on our YouTube channel. And last but not least, I wanted to turn your attention to a few key resources connected to the call of actions put forward during the events. First, the private sector plays a key role in contributing to a just transition that leaves no one behind. And to help companies take action, we are developing a series of business briefs. 2 are already available for you. This first introductory brief, and then a thematic brief aiming at demystifying just transition for adaptation. And additional briefs will come out in the coming weeks and months. Further, we are calling on all companies to set credible and science-based emission reduction targets to reach net zero aligned with 1.5. And to help companies on their target setting journey, we offer 2 e-learning courses breaking down the process of setting a science-based targets and a hands-on learning program implemented by Global Compact local networks. And this accelerator is concluding its second round as we speak, and very much encourage you to sign up for round 3 next year, which will open in March. And if you're headquartered in an African country, the Africa Business Leaders Coalition might be for you. This year at COP, the coalition brought forward a statement signed by 56 African companies representing a unified voice for the continent on climate action. So what's next? We spent this last hour discussing the climate COP27, but many of you will be aware that tomorrow another important COP is kicking off in Montreal, COP15 on biodiversity. And with the UN Environment Programme, the Compact has developed a biodiversity e-learning course to help you understand the importance of biodiversity to business and how to get started. And this course will be available on the Academy platform next week. And while we won't have enough space here to feature all of the activities Global Compact local networks across the globe are implementing, we highly recommend that you also get in touch with the network in your country to learn about their offerings tailored to regional and national contexts. Last but not least, stay tuned in the next few months for additional resources in the lead up to COP28. And with this, we are concluding today's COP27 debrief. Thank you very much for joining our Academy session and for engaging in the chat and the Q&A. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our speakers, and have a good rest of your week.